Hello to everyone on Zoom. Do you hear me? Can you hear me? Perfect. But I don't hear you. Pascal, ich höre dich nicht bis jetzt, aber... Jetzt aber doch. Vielen Dank. Guten Morgen allerseits. Good morning to everyone here in the Kammermusiksaal der Musikhochschule Lübeck, as well as on Zoom or on YouTube. Welcome to the second day of our Congress on the music of Fausto Romitelli, to the first session. And I will invite everybody kindly to leave comments or to ask questions, for example, on the chat function on YouTube. I will read it and I will transfer it to our speakers. And now, let's start with our first speaker. I have the great pleasure to introduce Pascal Decroupet. He's a professor for musicology at the University in Nice, and he's a distinguished expert for new music, especially in the field of sketch studies, and he has a quite long list of publications on the music, for example, on Berlioz, Boulez, Brown, Cage, Ferneyhough, Grisset, Kagel, Lachenmann, Maderna, Pousseur, Romitelli, everybody, virtually everybody, Stockhausen, Stroppa, and last but not least, our friend Bernd Alois Zimmermann. Amongst his many publications, I want to point out just one, and this is the wonderful edition of the sketches and manuscripts of Martin sans Maître by Pierre Boulez. In his today's talk, he will discuss Romitelli in a broader context of sound composition of the 20th and 21st centuries. Pascal, welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you very much. Is it possible to raise the sound that I don't hear myself? Okay, thank you. So to begin, I would like to thank Oliver Korte, of course, for having invited me to this conference, and all of you who have worked so hard to make it possible under the actual conditions. My further thanks go to Gianmario Bobbio and Francisco Rorca, who allowed me to study the sketches of Professor Daltrip at the Fondazione Giorgini in Venice and provide and the related ideal of a fusion toward phenomena with heightened inner tension. What connects the different manifestations of atonal harmony is the preservation of precisely this inner tension within chords beyond any function of resolution. On the other hand, the complex, unpitched sounds of percussion instruments step out of the harmonic control area, while offering up to then unexplored sonic realities. A composer like Henry Cowell, who grew up in California in the direct exchange with Central and South American, but also Asian musical cultures, developed a completely different relationship to the percussive sounds than, for example, Arnold Schoenberg. Arnold Schoenberg, who, for his part, shifted his considerations of the sound complexity into the structure of his harmony, as is already evident from the examples he gives at the end of his Harmonielehre. And the example you see here is very well known, is of course one chord from Erwartung. The first example I will discuss and briefly introduce that we have a little bit sounds in the ears to start this morning, stems from Anton Webern's 6 Pieces for Orchestra, and especially the second movement, because there we have a special combination, and this is what I have highlighted in red and in blue. There we have special combinations of flattertongues in the trombones with the bass drum, and on the other hand, we have tremolos and trills in horns and trumpets, together with root and cymbals. Simply for the anecdote, I needed to look for a certain number of records, because in numerous records, of course, the percussion instruments are so behind the rest of the orchestra that you have this nice sound. But I think that the intention of Webern here was precisely to have this mixture and precisely to show this fusion between complex harmony and complex sounds as you have them in the percussion instruments. Now I hope that the sound example will work. This record was conducted by Ernest Bohr. Another example with Webern are, of course, the famous 6-tone sounds in the first movement of the second cantata, Opus 31. They have been celebrated for many decades because precisely they can no longer be decomposed on the basis of usual tonal categories, which unfortunately still happens today when discussing sounds, as the famous Sacre chord by Igor Stravinsky, which is allegedly polytonal, but what one could consider this also from a completely different perspective. Edgar Varèse, like Webern, combined a consistent atonal harmony with a search for more complex sounds. And the various interrelationships of these two sound worlds in works like Hyperprism and Integral naturally resulted in ionizations for percussions only. By doing so, Varèse was in line with other composers of the young American music scene, such as Amadeo Roldan and Carlos Chavez, and the young John Cage and Lou Harrison also took their starting point here. What at first may have been merely a combination of instruments from different instrumental cultures, musical cultures, gradually transformed into a discourse of the inclusion of all possible sounds in music. In this context, it must be considered, however, that on the one hand, the emerging technologies of sound reproduction enormously increased the possibilities to transport sounds independently of their production conditions, and that on the other hand, the composers made a virtue out of the necessity and in absence of percussion instruments, as a consequence of the depression of the 1930s, converted any interesting sound object or sounding object, for example, car brake drums, found in the junkyard, into musical instruments. And here I've taken two excerpts from scores, one Pulse by Henry Cowell, the other, the first construction, originally construction in metal by John Cage, both from 1939. And the fact that probably these brake drums, car brake drums, appear in both compositions is due to the fact that Cage had arranged his group to play all this percussion music and commanded also a certain number of pieces. And Cowell, who had already made the Ostinato Pianissimo in the early 30s, contributed a further piece with Pulse. And so you see here that these brake drums, who are kind of tam-tams in a certain way, between the tam-tam and a Chinese bell. And so they have this same function, but indeed it's a kind of ready-made within the music. But the importance is not the ready-made, the importance is the sound that these instruments deliver. Another way to consider pitch was to detach it from its normal behavior in Western music, which is frequency stability. There were many such experiments with sliding tones within the American ultramodern group. At first, you will hear Cowell's introduction to his ballet music Atlantis of 1926, where vocalists and strings systematically exploit the domain of glissandi, and afterwards the beginning of Cage's Imaginary Landscape 1, using records either with stable or gliding frequencies, both submitted to speed changes on the record player. So first, Cowell, Atlantis. And afterwards, the first Imaginary Landscape by John Cage. The beginning is very soft, but it will become clear there is no technical problem. The second sound. And so the glissando you just heard is due to two elements. First, the record itself is a frequency record with sliding tones. It's for measurement purposes. The second one is, you see in the score, you see these crosses. And these are the tempo changes you have to do on the record player. And so when you change the tempo, of course, the change is not immediate, but it slows down, it accelerates, and that gives a certain level of sliding tones. Okay. Pierre Schaeffer certainly drew inspiration for his invention of musique concrète, both from surrealism and his work as a radio engineer, but even his early Études de bruit from 1948 showed that the sound sources were not the center of his consideration. For in addition to sounds of locomotives and turnstiles, he also used sounds of conventional music instruments. Synthetic sound composition, as undertaken in the early sine tone composition realized in Cologne in 53-54, did aim to produce new timbres in accordance with serially regulated interval proportions between the partials, thus resulting in a modification of the harmonic overtone principle. Such an intention is highly symptomatic of the middle of the 20th century, when synthetic materials increasingly entered the everyday world and began their triumph over natural substances. In the music of the 1960s, one can observe an acceleration and an increasing focus on so-called extended playing techniques, whether in the music of Christoph Penderecki, Maurizio Kagel, Giorgio Ligeti, Michael von Biel, or in Luciano Berio's sequencing. The slide shows the beginning of sequencer 3 for female voice in both my colored score, I like to color score, it's about time, so it has to be colored, and the handmade transcription of the sonic result with the help of a graphic vocabulary developed by Lasse Thoresen in his research on oral sonology. The squares symbolize complex sounds, let's say noises, the dots tonic sounds, tonic in the sense of Schaeffer sounds with a clear perceptible pitch. As you can see, the development of this first phrase is entirely built upon the interaction of 3 types of sonic events. Continuously sustained events with an iterative quality is the bubbling at the beginning, fast impulses without a defined rhythmic profile. Then this is what appears in green on the screen. And then the second one is the change from blue to yellow and back to blue. These are continuously sustained pitch events with timbral modulations through changing voyelles. And the third element is a rhythmically and melodically defined figure that transforms the spoken voice into song informations and usually ends with a distinct high-pitched accent. We listened and my record begins at 10 seconds in the score.
Sing to me, sing to me, sing to me, sing to me. To me, to me, too. Oh, to the beef, to
And so the 2 distinctions here, which become then really, which are paradigmatic for the whole 20th century, is the opposition between complex and tonic on the one hand, and on the second hand, this difference between the iterative continuation and a so-called, Boulez would call this lisse, so a continuous, smooth continuation. Okay. With his Microphonie 1, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen embarked on a path that can certainly be understood as an extension of his sonic research in the studio, but which is symptomatic of a more general change in perspective in composing, namely the ever finer listening into the inner life of sounds and the bringing up of these new realms of experience to the audible surface. This was possible thanks to an original amplification technique in which the microphone, as you see on the lower part of the projection, where the microphone is used as a stethoscope to literally investigate the richness of the tam-tam's vibration. And the score excerpt you have in front of you, you see in the, it's 2 parts. In the upper part you have Spieler 1, is the one who plays on the tam-tam. And the second one is the microphonist, like Fritsch in the photo you see there. And you see that there are movements drawn to approach the microphone either to the tam-tam or to the point where the tam-tam has been excited. And so it's really this possibility of listening into all possible sounds of the finer vibrations of this tam-tam sound. This expansion of the sonic materials was taken up at the end of the 1960s by Helmut Lachenmann, for example, who in times of political unrest and parallel to countercultural phenomena in rock music, simply think of Woodstock, added an explicitly political note to the sounds of his Musik concrète instrumentale, not unlike Adorno's interpretation of dissonance with Schoenberg in his Philosophie der Neuen Musik. Noise productions on conventional instruments and the attack on the bourgeois institution of the concert or on the educated bourgeois are indeed inseparable in Lachenmann's self-understanding. In contrast, the sonic introspections of Gérard Griset, Tristan Murail, Michael Levinas or Hugues Dufour since the beginning of the 1970s seem to be a retreat into the aesthetic. But this simple formulation already contains a value judgment that is based on the absolutization of a specific point of view. To my understanding, also work of Brian Fernio is more concerned with sonic results than with musical sociological implications. The complex notation is revelatory. Oh, wrong, is revelatory of certain aspects of his research within sound, but complexity not necessarily equals noise, and there are both sides in his music. A complexity provided by extended playing techniques, but also a complexity through écriture, through writing, through compositional strategies. Particularly among French composers who are now almost 50 years old, Raphaël Sendo, Franck Bedrosian, Yann Robin, there is a second post-spectral generation who include Romitelli as a milestone in their self-definition and who deal intensively with various facets of overloading of musical textures and of distortion of sound, what they call simply saturation. Point 2, technology that changed the look into sound and at some time co-conditioned it. As second excursion, I would like to revisit some of the stages mentioned above in order to consider them against the background of the technologies that were available in each case, because these technologies play a decisive role in the concrete examination of the inner life of sounds. In the 1920s, Varèse was still entirely dependent on acoustic literature, including Hermann von Helmholtz's Lehre von den Tonempfindungen, which he possessed in French translation. Although electric instruments were just beginning to emerge at this time, it was only from the early 30s onward that Varèse were able to exchange ideas with inventors of such instruments like René Bertrand in Paris and later Leon Theremin once he moved to America. Nevertheless, the study of scientific literature and his attentive listening to the sounds led him to new musical ideas, such as the concentration on a single sound at the beginning of hyperprism, a sound that is varied in its temporal extension to reveal the peculiarities of its attack and its changes during the sustain. More precisely, and this is what you see in front of you, this is transcription because it's only on one page, you do not need the score, but you have the different instruments, the muted trombone, the muted horns, the open horns, the bass trombone is another layer, and then you have a kind of analysis according to attack, sustain, and decay. This beginning of hyperprism is about the sonic mutation of the trombone, tenor trombone, sharpened by the mute, towards the soft sound of the open horn. Both instruments being actually only two facets of one same sound. It's not a question of counterpoint. It's one sound modulated through different means. After the reference sound is played by the trombone, the successive transformations reveal continuously changing aspects of this sound, once prolonged through a time mutation from aggressive to round. The second time is the one I have shown with the little blue arrow and with the micro, is really a change within one sound. And in the next transformation, it becomes more aggressive, since the second and third horns play now iterative flutter tones. In the third time, this iterative brrr becomes ratatatatata, becomes rhythm. And so this is why you have then these stronger rhythmic pulsations in the third transformation. As you see at the end of all this development, what you have in micro change between the trombone and the open horn at the beginning becomes also the overall change for the whole section. The last figure is played indeed by the open horn. We hear this. Okay. At the end of the 40s, Schaeffer initiated his Musique Concrète, but had to begin only record players at his disposal for his Musique Concrète. And it was the ways in which they were manipulated or certain material defects, such as the closed groove, that led him to completely new insights into the world of sound. For the first time, it became possible to listen to an identical sound several times and to focus attention on an increasingly large number of aspects of a constant object, as in scientific investigation. There are also first insights into the hearing conditions of sounds thanks to Schaeffer's experiments with truncated sounds, where he cut off the sound heads, and from this he drew consequences concerning the timbre recognition in accordance with the attack transients. When Stockhausen undertook his first sine tone composition in 1953, the sine tone was considered to be the musical atom. Through stratifications in variable ratios, different sound qualities were to be produced, whose microstructure corresponded with the interval ratios in the other musical dimensions. In 55-56, for Gesang der Jünglinge, Stockhausen included additional acoustic knowledges, namely the complete range of characteristics of attack and decay. In this way, musical time with its various manifestations moved to the center of compositional attention. Furthermore, the use of different sound generators, sine tone generator, noise generator, impulse generator, and different filter devices led to a reflection on the acoustic inner structure of the sounds. From then on, and this is what you see on the graph, in addition to the harmonic domain represented by the sine tone structures, sine tone mixtures, the aleatory or statistics of noise bands was considered an independent form of organization that could be projected onto the level of composed structures, including form. Thanks to various deformations of the harmonic overtone spectrum, this is what you see on the left, emerged a continuum of degrees of order of complexity from the most simple periodic sound, it's the sound on the left, the sine wave, to the more aleatoric mass phenomena you have then on the right of this slide. For Contacte, this is 58-60, Stockhausen took up an approach by Berriot, who had worked with impulse rhythm at variable speeds in perspectives in 1957. From this, Stockhausen derived the possibility of composing qualitatively different timbres. The more regular the rhythm, the more tonic the timbre. The more aperiodic the rhythm, the more noisy the resulting timbre. And this, he realized it through a controlled acceleration technique. And so now, in this new stage, a few years later, the impulse was regarded as the musical atom. A few years later, when Gottfried Michel Koenig had new devices developed in the mid-1960s at the Studio for Sonology in Utrecht, Netherlands, which included the recent technology of voltage control in particular, the view shifted once again. From now on, composition took place on the level of amplitude and the amplitude curve. The best known musical results of this research are Koenig's series of Funktionen as Aspekt and Aspekt by Konrad Böhmer. Thus we have arrived at the beginning of the computer age, although experiments with computers had already been carried out at American research institutions since the 1950s. Yannis Xenakis had for the first time used computers in his compositional process in the early 1960s also. And various other basic research had been advanced, notably at the Bell Laboratories. I simply recall the names of Max Matthews, James Tenney, and Jean-Claude Risset. Of central importance, however, is a renewed shift in the focus of observation, where in the preceding decades, the view had moved away from pitch or had been directed to those factors on which it was assumed that also pitch depended. Computer analysis now offered an insight into sound construction in which was achieved not only a previously unknown refinement of overtone structure, but could be dependent especially but could deepen especially the interaction between the musical dimension, pitch, time, and loudness as construction factor of timbre. This has led to a return of discussion about pitch, which I consider problematic in the context of sound-oriented music, because it seems to me that cause and symptom have been confused. This is all the more urgent to consider, as even in the newest analytical tool, the so-called audio descriptors, the dependence on pitch seems to orientate major parts of the discourse. Okay, there I have, oh no, I'm sorry. I thought I had made a mistake. The consequence of such computer-aided sound analysis are well known, especially in Griset's work, and since then in daily practice of so many composers. The new view into microstructure, this new world of sound experiments that composers suddenly had in front of them, should also be opened up for the listeners. This is what I see as the motivation of Griset's synthèse instrumentale, namely the making audible of sonic peculiarities of a reference sound through an orchestration in which each instrument brings a sonic component of the said reference sound to the ear. It is precisely the difference between the compositional work and the verification of an acoustical principle. Such principles do not have any place in a concert hall, that shows the importance of the spectral music, precisely because this latter has always gone far beyond the naked scientific aspect. As is well known, Griset rather worked on basic acoustic phenomena, or as relatively basic transformations. Muraille explored the effect of electroacoustic transformation devices, while Levinas, he was very close to Fausto Romitelli, enjoyed various inferences which have the impure of the sound as a subject. And the example I've taken here is from Appel. It's the piece he wrote after coming back from Darmstadt in '74. And there he combines different instruments with snare drums. And so the brass instruments play in front of snare drums, and so the whole sound is always reverberated and transformed. And this has a sonic quality that is certainly of interest also in a reference for Romitelli. Play the second time. Then it goes on above. Okay, I will skip one element to come immediately now to Fausto Romitelli, because I think I'm fairly running out of time. Okay, let's have a look into Romitelli's workshop. I would not say that I'm a Romitelli specialist, since up to now I've simply looked in his documents for one piece. And so I speak about them, and the specialists and the friends of Fausto will tell me what they think about that. So my consideration starts from 3 levels of observation in order to finally listen more closely to the beginning of the work. First, in Romitelli's sketches are various lists of sound transformations procedures, and that is what you see here in my transcription, almost all of which relate to effects for electric guitars. All these effects have in common that the sound is modified after the attack, be it on a rhythmic, like the echo, on a dynamic, like the expansion or the compression, or a timbre level, like the filtro vocale, the Doppler, the chorus, and all these things. And you see that in certain of these sketches, you have always slight dynamic indications that show precisely that the resonance phenomena through the transformations is something that appears progressively once the impact has been given. Okay, we see now another sketch which relates to the echo. Since Romitelli is interested in transferring suggestions from the sound world into a composition for ensemble, the results of such effects can be found in the sketches translated into musical notation. Here we have the example of the echo, and you see that there is not only the rhythm that changes on each level so that you have a kind of acceleration from level to level, but you have also these changes between the vowels, and you have to play to sing them slowly to have this, not to have this overtone flowings. And you see that the relation of the E and the U, so of the attack, the high attack and the lower resonance, which is always with this dynamics towards the U, that this changes also. And you see that the last versions are really explosive sound, you. And this makes, of course, that he really tries to work out different aspects and to decompose all the parameters of such effects where he simply has one reference, but then he tries to work out a certain number of aspects which can be submitted to real composition. This is an original sketch with a formal plan for the first section I will discuss at the end of my talk. And there we see that Romitelli uses 7 different effects distributed according to a wave of accumulation. You see in red the numbering of the sequences, and below the circled black figures, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 3, 2, and there you see there is a wave of complexity by addition of a certain number of effects, and then by reduction. What you cannot see now, because you do not have the time to read everything, that's echo, this distortion, acuto, FM, bell, and then the different distortions and chords, chord effects, is that there is also a superordinated process from simple to complex events. That is from echo and harmonic introspection into the sound, going to then with the distortion and the chords which are inharmonic, going really to the noisier aspect of the story. This is an excerpt of another element that will be crucial for the beginning of Professor Badstrip, and this is the model that is called beta. And now I will try 2 or 3 short harmonic incursions into the material. So what you see here, you have 3 times this characteristic sound, you know, this tutu. And this is precisely the figure you see on the left upper side, and then on the left you have a first version, and then the real elaboration with this supplementary color indication on the right. What you see principally is that you have a fundamental shift from C sharp to E, this glissando in the lower part, and that above you have different supplementary tones. So for the C sharp to have C sharp and G sharp in a higher register, it's completely normal, but there is also the E natural. The E natural is too low to be a harmonic fifth, the fifth harmonic. And this probably refers to the bell sound, or the bell-like sound that was probably the point of departure of so many reflections by Fausto Romitelli, and there precisely this too low third is one of the enharmonic qualities of such bell sounds. You see also that you have a higher G, which of course is then in diminished octave relation with the G sharp, which is the fifth, so the third harmonic of the fundamental G sharp. And you see that when the fundamental has shifted to the E, then there is a so-called correction from this G, the too low third, to the G sharp, which becomes really the fifth harmonic. But at the same time, you have in the higher register then this B flat, which is again a kind of enharmonic perturbance, because it's of course the chromatic relation to the fifth of the E, which is the B. Okay. Now we come to a transcription I did, which is part of this sketch with the distribution plan of the effects. And what is interesting here is that we have a chord succession with different particularities. So we first listen to it, so that you may have an idea, and then I show you 2 or 3 things how to interpret the result of the transformation from this basic chord, which is a minor C minor chord, C sharp minor chord, with this G natural above, and then you have this transformation.
Pascal?
Yeah?
Just before we hear it, we have to take a look at the time a bit.
Yeah.
Please. Yeah, thank you.
I have to accelerate from, okay. So you have seen that at the beginning you have this transformation of this more tonal sound towards this chord, and you see it in the lower part of the example that all the new sounds always have chromatic relations with elements in the lower part, within this C sharp minor. And then at the end you transform this chord in really something that is much more inharmonic, because it's typically a chord built of different types of fourth. And these are things we have in other parts of Romitelli's sketches, as you see it here in the right lower part. And in the left upper part, there is a phenomenon that Romitelli in his sketches calls the FM modulation. I have not been able to make the relation with the so-called frequency modulation on synthesizer in the 80s. What I find here is that you have a clear reference to the harmonic scale, and the combination, if you look at J2, J3, J4, and 5, the relation between this harmonic scale and the logic of superimposing different qualities of fourth intervals is given here, because in J3 he shifted lower harmonics, it's the third harmonic, the B, according to the E, which is the fundamental. And you see then that you have indeed F sharp, B, E, B flat, and then the E flat at the top. And then you have there still this kind of structure with the fourth. So now I have to shift. So indeed, we will do this. We have seen this table of the effects, and now we will listen to 2 excerpts from the beginning of Professor Bad's trip. So you have seen on the front of you, you have this excerpt of the score, and I have highlighted the different effects. So you have in the first example only the echo, wow, 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 and then the high distortion. At the end, you have the FM, and you will hear the complete first transformation, even if you don't have the score in front of you. But you will hear that suddenly it becomes far more clearer than what you have with this high distortion in number 3. For the next section, I'll show you simply the analysis with colors on the score. And so you see that this accumulation makes the situation more and more difficult. Let's take just the last element, where, in fact, by means of acceleration and compression of the effects, it nearly becomes impossible to distinguish the things. And I think that this is aesthetically precisely one goal that Romitelli had, through this acceleration, precisely not to be able to have any longer distinction. And so it becomes a kind of confusion, but with very clear ingredients that have been presented earlier. Okay, I'm sorry for having come completely out of time, but I will nevertheless want to say one sentence of conclusion. As you probably have seen, all these interesting topics that the previous speakers in this conference have highlighted with respect to Romitelli's aesthetic self-definition, his compositional tools to construct musical form, his relations to extra musical thought in literature or in more cultural domains. All these elements are echoed in the proper sounds Romitelli composed from their inner conditions. And as you perhaps have seen also in the first larger part of my talk, that these thoughts have been in a certain way pre-echoed in the search within the domain of timbre or sound along the complete 20th century. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Pascal, for this very rich talk. And I guess we have now some kind of bow wave of informations and questions that have to be postponed to our concluding discussion. But I'm very sorry, we have to go on. And everybody who has questions, please spare it for our discussion in this evening. Is that okay for you, Pascal?
Of course, it's my fault that I have been too long.
Okay. Under these circumstances, now I will warmly welcome Fabian Luchterhandt. Fabian Luchterhandt is a pianist, he's an organist, and he's a composer, rewarded with numerous prizes and scholarships. He holds a degree in church music here from Lübeck, and he currently completes his piano master's degree with Konrad Elser in Lübeck. Since 2020, he's solely responsible for the music at the Lübeck Dome, at the Lübeck Cathedral, And the title of his talk today will be Spectral Chords in Amok Koma. And this is quite interesting because Ingrid has also spoken already about Amok Koma, and we can compare some of the results maybe. Amok Koma and how Romitelli interprets them. Fabian.
Yes, thank you very much, Oliver, for this introduction. And also thank you very much that I have the opportunity to speak today about Amok Koma. And I'd like to start with this title. Oh, sorry. So, it looks like we have a problem with the presentation. So just I wait for a second.
There we go.
Yes. Okay, thank you. So, Amok Koma, two words with almost contradictory meanings, each of which, when read backwards, produces the other one. Together they form a palindrome, a kind of wordplay, according to a popular cliché, wonderfully suitable as the title of a contemporary artwork. But the effect of this title is quite different. Amok and Koma are kind of charged words. Both evoke a lot of associations. Tides of strong images flood the inner eye when reading this title. A ruthless, violent act, brutal and extremely dynamic. In contrast, the state of limbo between life and death, twilight on the verge of complete torpor. The wordplay is noticed afterwards, and yet it forms the connection, the glue. It makes the two words a concept pair. It suggests that both complement each other to something above, that the contrast of the two words only circumscribe the actual meaning. What an incredibly fitting title for Romitelli's music. Amok Koma was commissioned by the Centre International de Création Musicale in 2001 and had its first performance in Nice on November 11. Its instrumentation, actually quite similar to that of Professor Bad Trip, I noticed that yesterday in the concert, is divided into three groups, each consisting 3 instruments, 3 woodwinds, 3 strings, and the kind of rhythm section, piano, percussion, and synthesizer. And live electronics are also used. Romitelli himself wrote the following program note. In this work, I started from a very simple idea, repetition degradation of the material. The linear processes, predictable and therefore reassuring, will be progressively oriented towards the extreme poles of silence and saturation by slowing down to immobility or accelerating to paroxysm. The idea of a musical process is only a pretext allowing me to make perceptible what really interests me, the occurrence of a hidden violence, which reveals itself only by the chaotic drift of the material, by the ritual of its destruction as a discursive and form-carrying element, and its resurrection as an incandescent material from then on out of any control. He speaks about the contrast, the extreme poles of the title. Sorry, everything's okay? Okay. So he speaks about the contrast of the title, the extreme poles, absolute silence and complete saturation. But at the same time, there's another contrast, linear musical processes and the ritual of their destruction. In his talk yesterday, Jakob Rieke already mentioned the processual but also kind of transcendent and religious idea of rituals that is present in some of Romitelli's works. By the way, at the beginning of Amok Koma, Romitelli gives the indication rituale. During his time in Paris, Romitelli got to know Gérard Griset's spectral music firsthand. It is full of linear processes, which are translated into scores with great consistency. At times, this gives the pieces an almost hermetic unity. The piece ends together with the end of the process. It is the main concern of the music to bring the processes into sound. Romitelli goes one step further. He contrasts the pole of continuous reassuring processes with the chaotic drifting, but not random chaos. Chaotic means rather the arbitrary breaking through of the processes themselves in Romitelli's own words, ritual destruction. As contradictory as the two strategies seem to be, they are mutually dependent. The actual goal, the resurrection out of any control, arises from their clash, their collision. Amok Koma reveals numerous such pairs of opposites of the structural, the organized, and at the same time chaotically drifting. I would like to present to you one of these such pair of opposites concerning the harmony. Amok Koma is composed in a rather vertical way. Most of you may have listened to Ingrid Pustianak's presentation yesterday. She already gave us a little impression of the chordal structure of Amok Koma. Thank you for that. Most of the piece could be described as an instrumentation, a kind of staging of a sequence of chords. For almost every moment of the piece, an underlying chord can be identified, from which the other notes originate. Very often these chords are played by piano, synthesizer, and percussion, what I really like to call rhythm section, while the other instruments are moving within the chords. You see an excerpt from the score. Piano, percussion, and synthesizer play a chord progression. I have colored all the notes in the remaining parts that are contained in the respective chords. This could be continued in the same way for large parts of the piece. So, most of these chords reoccur over and over again. Therefore, the chordal structure can be detected even in passages that, at first glance, do not reveal any chords. I know this maybe might look a bit confusing, but best you just pay attention at the colors. So, again, synthesizer, percussion, and in this case, the cello, reveal when the chord changes and which one it is. The notes of the other instruments can relatively easily be assigned. The notes which are not marked here are, with few exceptions, chromatically connected to the pitches of the chords. So the individual voices, flute and violin, for example, complement each other to form trills around the notes of the chords. Let's listen to that once. Acoustically, the chords are thus barely perceptible. All that remains is a nervous flickering. Nevertheless, the music is obviously based on the underlying chords. This simplifies the description of harmony because it limits what is actually meant by the term harmony, namely the vertical structure of these chords and their sequence. By the way, the chords have fixed pitches. The individual notes are never shifted or transposed. Amok Koma, we all might know that, begins with these three chords. As you see, they are repeated once. Oh, actually there's a difference between what I see here and what I see here. That's a bit confusing, but okay. So, just go on. Ich bin einen Schritt weiter. I'm one step further than... Yes. Listen again. Oh, okay. So, now it's good. I just wanted to make sure that it's not the rest of the presentation, because that would be a pity. So, again, the beautiful chords. And of course, I had the same idea as Ingrid Pustianek yesterday to call them 1, 2, 3. For the sake of clarity, by the way, you only see the voices of the rhythm section because this is the easiest way to recognize the chords. And now, beginning with chords number 1 and 2, a repeating chord progression gradually builds up. More and more chords are added. Let's listen to it. I refer to this chord progression as an ostinato, marked here in blue. In its full length, the ostinato consists in total of 17 chords. Let's listen to the first time the ostinato appears in its entirety. During the piece, the ostinato is repeated in its entirety around 20 times. Between the ostinatos, there are freer sections in which the beginning 3 chords play a significant role. Alongside these 3 chords appear around 20 more chords, each, however, played only once or maybe twice. So about 90% of the piece consists of ostinato passages and the chords 1, 2, 3 from the beginning. Almost all of these chords consist of 6 to 9 notes, which cover a fairly large range. But what can one say about these chords? Well, one could try to find tonality in them. For example, G major is contained in chord number 1, or B flat major in the second chord, or even A major. The third chord, in the third chord, one can find C sharp minor, and the top 3 notes form a C major triad. And of course, many more in the chords that follow. At this point, I am sure that Olivier Messiaen would want to send his greetings due to the fact that he refers to this phenomenon as triads with added notes. And one finds surprisingly many such triads throughout the ostinato. Also tetrachords and pentachords, which we know from tonal contexts. Sometimes one on top of another one in the same chord, as we see here in chord number 2 and 3. But something else is striking. Within some of the chords, the intervals become consistently smaller from the bottom to the top. Pyramid-like, so to speak. I've marked that for the first chord, the second and the third chord, but it goes on in the same way for the other chords. So pyramid-like because of the bigger intervals at the bottom and the smaller at the top. And such interval structures are characteristic for spectral chords. Indeed, if you take a closer look at the following passage near the end of the piece, you will rediscover many of the chords from the ostinato. Let's listen to it. The passage ends with the beginning chords 1, 2, and 3. I have written the chords out for the sake of clarity. So the last chord is our chord number 1. And then would follow 2 and 3, of course. And there are many more correspondences with chords from the ostinato. This chord progression is a series of spectral stretches based on the first 7 to 9 partials of the natural spectrum above E. A natural spectrum is pulled apart over a constant fundamental note, in this case E, by erasing each frequency by the same exponent. The approximated exponents of the chords that you see here are shown below. Exponents. The natural E spectrum itself does not occur in the score. Stretching a spectrum makes all intervals within the spectrum equally larger. So the octave becomes a 9th, a 10th, 11th, and so on. However, the proportions of the intervals within one chord remain the same, which means larger intervals at the bottom of the chord, smaller intervals at the top. What I like to call pyramid-like interval structures. Therefore, all chords created in this way have exactly this characteristic pyramid-like interval structure of the first ostinato chords. Strictly speaking, of course, such a spectral stretching results in many microtones. Already the underlying undistorted natural spectra can only be represented approximately without microtones. In other works, Romitelli often uses quartet tones. Here, strangely enough, he doesn't. The spectral chords in Amok Koma are all rounded to semitones. One reason for this is probably the prominent position of the piano, mostly playing the underlying chords. Thus, the ostinato chords are spectral. Since his time in Paris, Romitelli used the techniques of the spectralists, especially distorted spectra, in almost all his works. But how does this describe the effect of the harmony in Amok Koma? Is everything resolved simply by recognizing that the chords are derived from spectra? Distorted spectral chords differ fundamentally in sound character in comparison to undistorted ones. They sound dissonant and rather unspecific compared to the distinctive sound of a pure spectrum. The spectrum can really only be sonically felt after it has been gradually stretched to its kind of snapping point where it has become consonant again. This way of distorting spectra often occurs in the work of Gérard Griset, and we find it quite similarly at the end of Amok Koma. However, when the chords appear outside of this context, like our ostinato chords do, isn't their origin as a distorted spectrum purely theoretical? So, to describe the harmony, do we have to come back to the contained triads after all? Or does it contradict the structuralist consequent of spectralism to search for supposedly randomly contained triads? Well, it looks like Romitelli is specifically looking for exactly this contradiction. Let's listen to the end of the piece. So from the three beginning spectral chords, 1, 2, 3, Romitelli gradually peels out a kind of C major cadence. I have written a kind of harmony reduction of this coda. Only 2 notes are added, C and G, to the spectral chords, while at the same time notes are gradually omitted, until only the somewhat strange cadence remains at the end. The dominant-like chord at the end reminds one of a blues-like subdominant, maybe. Before that, rather of a dominant 7th chord with an added 9th. The tonic still concerns this disturbing minor third as a remnant of the original spectrum, but the effect of C major, respectively minor, cannot be ignored. Here you can see the origins of the cadence in the spectral chords. So it is sufficient to omit some notes and add only 2, especially the new bass note C, to form a cadence from the 3 chords out of the spectral stretching. By the way, a rather consistent process that we see here, but in the end, the disturbing E flat remains, on purpose, of course. But back to the spectral chords of the ostinato. Above, you can see the stretched spectra of measures 228 to 239, and below is the complete ostinato. Apparently, the spectral chords and the related ostinato chords are not fully identical. Romitelli changed some notes by adding them into his ostinato, more precisely, some of the bass notes. The intention is clear. An ostinato consisting of all the spectral chords based on E would logically share E as a common pedal tone throughout, which Romitelli, however, obviously didn't intend. Instead, he composed a new bass line. But there seems to be a system behind the new bass tones. This is chord number 2, how it sounds in its original microtonal spectral form. This is how it sounds with the pitches rounded to semitones. And now, the part of the chord that Romitelli integrates into the ostinato. The lowest 2 notes are missing. First, the microtonal spectral version. And the semitonal version. One can now easily perceive the contained B flat major triad. And which note does Romitelli add as a new bass note to replace the 2 missing notes? B flat. Chord 2 almost always occurs in the ostinato with B flat as the bass note. For comparison, listen again to the different versions of the chord. First, spectral and microtonal. Rounded to semitones. Without the original bass notes. And finally, with the new bass note B flat, as it is part of the ostinato. B flat major, isn't it? The situation is quite similar with chord number 3. It contains C sharp minor. Romitelli adds a C sharp in the bass. Chord 4 receives a G in the bass. Likewise, chord 5, 6, and 11. Finally, chord number 1 already contains the two notes G and E in its original spectral form. Romitelli integrates both as alternative bass notes for chord 1 into his ostinato. So, my first interpretation of the chords as tonal with added notes almost hit the mark, but at the same time, they are also derived from distorted spectra. So, how might have these hybrid ambiguous chords been developed? Romitelli undoubtedly knew the spectral stretchings by heart. The spectral stretch at the end of Amok Koma, what you see here above, is kind of the most obvious one over its fundamental E, the fundamental of Gérard Griset's Espace Acoustique, on which many spectra and other Romitelli works are also based. Perhaps Romitelli perceived the triads contained in these spectra as kind of hidden harmonic forces. Hidden because they are subordinate to the consistent construction of the spectral chords. The underlying fundamental E fully dominates the other tones. They remain partials of this E, just stretch apart. Only the detachment from the E, the omission of the bass tone, unleashes their hidden harmonic power. Romitelli chose the newly added bass notes in such a way that they help one of the contained forces to make its breakthrough. The new bass note, the new root, conquers the chord with the simple means of a tonal association and easily defeats the structuralist effect of the distorted E spectra. What remains are only ruins in the form of the tones seemingly added to the triads, remnants of the broken, rigid structure of the spectra, decaying relics of the linear processes of spectral stretching, in Romitelli's own words, chaotically drifting. I find that fascinating, this harmonic power of the new root notes, which interact with the actually distorted spectral chord rests so strongly that one suddenly thinks they are hearing B flat major. And another question arises: why does this approach work so incredibly well? Why are there suggestions for tonal associations in so many of the chords in Romitelli's spectral stretch series? The reason for this is the pyramid-like interval structure of the distorted spectral chords. If their pitches are rounded to semitones, as in Amok Koma, we find almost automatically cells of superimposed major sixth, minor sixth, and fifth, or even fourth, major third, and minor third. Thus, there are often triads, or tetrachords and pentachords that recall memories of a tonal context. In most cases, however, these strongly dissonate with the spectral fundament and its undistorted natural partial tones. So the tonal associations are mostly overlaid by these dissonances. To illustrate this again, let's listen to the series of spectral stretches Romitelli used in Amok Koma. You'll hear the first 9 partials of the spectrum over E, stretched by the exponents of the bars 228 to 239, and rounded to semitones. And now, the same chord sequence, but without the 2 lowest notes. I would like to summarize referring to what we have just heard. Only at first sight, the distorted spectral chords are unspecific, dissonant, just parts of a process. The dominant force of the spectral bass tones keep them under control, suppresses their individual forces, but the whole structure is under tension. Romitelli seeks the destructive energy that is released when this tension is broken. He removes the spectral bass note, he tears the chords out of their order, they get spun around into a sort of chaotic drifting. Their individual harmonic forces suddenly break free and tonal associations emerge. Romitelli seems to have reinforced these associations by finding roots for them on his way to the hidden violence of decaying linear processes. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Fabian, for this extremely lucid talk and the very, very stunning examples in it. My first question would be, you have talked about the hermetic character of spectralism, of stretched or compressed spectra yourself. And now you have shown a strategy of Romitelli's to alter this strictness, to, in a way, to escape. And would you describe this strategy as a way, as an escape door from the hermetic closed system of spectralism for Romitelli or for others?
Yes, you could maybe describe it like that. That's a bit what he writes in his program note, or it reminds me of what he writes. Is yes, maybe I find it again. Oh, where is it? Sorry, here. He writes, the idea of a musical process is only a pretext allowing me to make perceptible what really interests me. So that maybe a bit explains the role of this linear musical processes for him. And of course, the role is important, as I tried to say in the end, that this tension of the quite rigid linear processes, quite rigid structures, is very important for the effect when they are broken. So it's not just he wanted to have a technique to invent chords and then find some tonal associations in them, but he absolutely needs this power of this rigid structure that is broken, and this kind of rests that a bit remain of this structure. And a little bit also this fight between the two thinkings, that's the once this quite structuralist thinking of big processes, and then the very, very simple idea of just tonal associations, which is mostly nearer to the view of listeners and the concert, maybe.
Are there any other questions? And when there are, please use the microphone here in front of you.
Yeah. Oliver, can I say something? I raised the hand, but probably you didn't see me. So thank you very much, Fabian, for this outstanding analysis, which is really, really very interesting from different point of view. So what I would stress is that you are completely right in underlying the ostinato structure built by 16 chords. This idea comes, I could find confirmation of that in sketches. So the sketches housed by the Fondazione Cini are really few and are completely unordered. So it was very hard to find the exact correspondence between the material and this work. But what is important is that there is a sketch with 16 pitches written only in the bass key that are the pitches that correspond to the synthesizer timbre. So Romitelli did synthesize a different 16 chords, and he, as a key player, keyboard player, you know that probably in the Amok Koma there are these 16 roots and these fundamentals, which are not fundamentals actually, because if you see the pitches are somewhere in the spectrum. And also there are a lot of sketches with experimentation of the spectral compression stretching coefficients. Yeah, the way you reconstruct the harmonic material, I found it very, very effective. That's really, and that I'm sure that when you could see the sketches, you will put together the information that you already found, and that there is some insights that also Alessandro Olto, who at the Archivio Ricordi has about the electronics, could confirm, because one thing that we didn't yet finish to do is the spectral analysis of the synthetic chords. That seems that perfectly fit to the instrumental chords, which is really astonishing idea that the electronic sound double the instrumental sound in very interesting way, but it's everything has to be done. And the second observation is about the perception, you know, because you spoke about the tonal elements in spectral music. There is something very particular about that, because we are all human, and we know that psychoacoustic has shown our cochlea map specific frequencies in specific parts, and there is also this masking effect. So it's very hard to evaluate how much do we listen tonal, because we are trained in this language, and how much we are free to listen in the more expanded way, so putting together the complexity of a spectral language. So that is really an issue, and it's and you put it wonderfully in as a problem, as a question. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
If I may interrupt, yeah, I have to tell you that we tried to make some kind of field study, so to say, in Venice last March, and everybody knows what happened then. So our sketch studies, in fact, lie ahead of us, but we definitely will travel all to Venice to confirm or to falsify our hypothesis on the pieces we analyzed, and this will be a brilliant time. But yeah, sadly we couldn't travel there.
Because it's really it's really worthwhile, because the Fabian's analysis is already on the right way. So I'm very happy that if you can put together the information.
We would have time for one tiny little question left. Pascal, I see Pascal.
And I have found my microphone. Very good. So thank you very much. So I would sustain what Ingrid just has said. So since Amok Koma has been composed in immediate context of Professor Beltrip, indeed, these kinds of stretching of harmonic spectra, you find them in numerous of these sketches. And it is not always, to me, it has not been possible to really understand how this stretching functions, but this is probably simply of personal limitations. So I would want to add one further element of reflection here. So I would not, there I agree with Ingrid, I would not speak about tonal chords, because it's this question of resonance. This you can see this in also the teaching by Griset, and also in other things. Simply think back in what were the important things in the Helmholtz book for Varèse, and things that have been stressed also by Griset in his articles. So I probably would more speak about the question of differential tones. So you have this spectrum, you distort it, and in a certain moment you find sounds that interact and that in a certain way provoke a new fundamental. And probably it's not, it's a kind then in the writing by Romitelli of a new polarization, but this is probably also a way to show how to interrelate different sounds based on different fundamentals. And my second observation is related to this question of process, and you spoke about a structuralist process. So I remember in the late 80s and beginning of the 90s, in the circle of the IRCAM, everybody spoke about interpolation. So you have a starting sound and you have an end sound, and then you try to construct transformations from one element to the next. And then finally you select the elements that would be usable for a presentation with temperate instruments. I think that what is interesting in Romitelli's process is that he has a starting point, then he begins to distort it, and in the difference with the IRCAM procedure, where you know where you will come to, he doesn't know that. So he has this exploration, or this, I don't know how to call it, exuberance of derivations, and then afterwards he observes different results and tries to find connections between these things. And if such a sketch documentation would probably be complete, we would find, a little bit like in Xenakis then, we would find hundreds of pages, and in certain pages, 1 or 2 selected chords, because these are then the structures which have such precise elements. And then there, Fabian, I think that your interpretation that these spectrum are not unspecific, but finally they find a new identity, and this new identity probably through this logic of differential tones, Romitelli gives them precisely, reinforces this identity to be able to connect them with other tones in his harmonic logic. But a harmonic logic that is, to me, more a spectral element than really a reflection on pitch combinations. But if you write for instruments, you need pitches. So it's always the kind of balance. But I was very, very happy with your presentation, and thank you very much for it. Thank you.
May I just add one?
Absolutely.
Because you were speaking now about this idea of a process that has a starting point and a goal that is exactly known, and you start from there and you go there, which is not really the case here. And that's a bit, or that reminds me to another sentence of his program note, where he says, yes, the ritual of its destruction, it's of the material, the ritual of the destruction of the material as a discursive and form-carrying element. And that's a bit that the processes are not anymore form carrying. They are not the most important force in the music, and every other aspect is a bit less important maybe than the process, but they are just one part of all, and there are several processes in the same time that don't really hit a goal, or where it's not really clear where they go, but they are quite consistent, so we really notice these processes, and sometimes we think why it goes this way, because it would be so consistent if not, and so yeah, for me it's really an interesting aspect that he writes himself about the ritual of its destruction as a form-carrying element. Yes.
Thank you very much, Fabian, for this wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Now we will have a coffee break all together, quite a bit longer than the last time, and we'll all meet again at 12 o'clock. Thank you.